Hey guys, Sun here. I'm a privacy and a security researcher and you're watching The Privacy Guides. Today I'm going to be answering a question that I'm asked all the time. Why in the world am I using macOS when I am promoting privacy, security, sovereignty, governance? Well, you know what? That's actually a great question. So I'm going to try to answer it today. Now, first things first, I've talked about this before. There is a spectrum between, convenience and total privacy and security. Now, either end is bad. If you're using convenience only, that means that, from a privacy and security standpoint, while you're on Facebook, you're using an operating system with no firewall. You're not aware of how technology actually works. You're just using it, and winging everything. I mean, that is okay, perhaps, for some users. I wish there was better legislation in place to protect those users' privacy, but anyways. And then there's the other side of the spectrum, which is total security and privacy, which totally doesn't exist, by the way. And if you're at that extreme, chances are you're going to go completely batshit crazy and freak out at every keystroke on the keyboard because you could have a keylogger, you could have a backdoor. Are you using an Intel CPU? Perhaps you have Intel Management Engine and the NSA is, backdoored into your system. I've been there, and it isn't a nice place to be. That extreme is very bad for our mental health. So I believe the solution is somewhere in the middle. Now, using a computer with a huge amount of security in place, that means that you probably have an application layer firewall and you need to accept all of the requests that are going outbound from your computer. I mean, it means that you're using Signal, you're using PGP, you're not touching email because that's totally unprivate. I mean, you get my point? It's a question of trade-offs. There is no silver bullet. Everyone will find the right place in that spectrum. And for me, I decided to probably not be in the middle, maybe a little bit towards more security and privacy. But the answer to this dichotomy, in my opinion, doesn't rest on if you're using macOS or Linux. It doesn't rest on if you're using, a MacBook Pro or if you're using a computer from Purism. It's a question of how we understand technology, and how we can apply this knowledge to using computers in a compartmentalized way where we're avoiding risks while keeping some level of convenience. And that is why I'm using macOS. I think that macOS, at least in the context of Catalina, is an amazing hybrid between a Linux/Unix operating system and an amazing user interface that Steve Jobs has, come up with in the days of Next. It's really a hybrid between really nerdy, powerful, command lineable, if that's even a word, environment with beautiful typography, colors, user interface design. And that is why I'm using Mac as my daily driver. Because you know what? Mac, at least for now, are running on Intel CPUs and Intel Management Engine, which I'll link in the description, by the way. I mean, we're vulnerable to that, but we are as well if we're using Linux. So, and by the way, when we're using full disk encryption, well, the encryption key is in the memory and the Intel Management Engine could likely have access to that. So really, there's no way of using technology on the internet safely. Now, talking about that, am I using Linux? Yes, I am using Linux every day of my life. I am administrating a bunch of servers. I have a bunch of Raspberry Pi devices. I run Tails OS on USB keys, etc., etc. So I am a huge Linux user, and I really love the Linux open source mentality. That being said, there are a few myths out there. One of them is open source is definitely better and safer than proprietary software. Well, I don't believe that's true. I think that if a company, even if it's proprietary, if that company has great governance, if that company really values privacy, they can build amazing technology that is proprietary, that will not invade our privacy, and will be extremely secure. Open source is a way for very educated and patient users to assess the security of a system or the privacy of a system. But the truth is, most users will never actually look at the source, and most users are not using application layer firewalls, so they don't know if their open source project is actually logging a whole bunch of stuff. They don't know if that code is vulnerable or not to a bunch of backdoor attacks. So in the end, open source versus proprietary, it doesn't mean because it's open source that it's safer, not at all. It doesn't mean because someone is using Linux that it's safer than Mac, not at all. Computers are inherently unsafe, and the internet is the far west. As soon as a computer is connected to the internet, everything can happen. That is why I don't really care which operating system I use. Now, I would never use Windows because I just like, the Linux/Unix environment too much. And I do believe that macOS and Linux is safer than Windows, but to be honest, this is kind of like a gut feeling. I haven't looked at Windows for quite some time. Now, back to compartmentalization and how I use Linux. I've mentioned in one of my first vlogs, actually, that I hate the new Mac computers with the T2 chip. The reason for that is that those versions of Mac computers have really shitty compatibility with Linux. I love my 2015 computers. As I mentioned in another episode, I've just purchased a 13-inch 2015 computer. My main computer is a 15-inch 2015, all of which do not have the T2 chip or that little bar thingy, screeny, whatever that is. And I also have an escape key. So point is, I can actually take my MacBook Pro, plug in the Tails operating system, and access an amnesic operating system that runs everything through Tor. And I can do this with this hardware. It's still vulnerable to the Intel ME backdoor, but nonetheless, it's pretty good. And most computers are Intel, right? Well, right, that's where Raspberry Pis come into play. Raspberry Pis have really amazing properties. I'm showing this. This is actually the case for my Raspberry Pi. For those of you who have no clue what Raspberry Pis are, probably not many of you, but it's totally fine. This is a Raspberry Pi. It's a small computer on a chip. And why I love Raspberry Pi so much is most of what's happening in the Raspberry Pi ecosystem is open source. And the Raspberry Pi itself has an ARM CPU, which is not vulnerable to the Intel management engine thing. So using those devices, it's really easy to disable all forms of network connectivity. And that means that those can be used as what we called cold computers, your cold storage devices or cold compute devices, which means that we can use those kind of computers to generate private keys, to sign transactions, to do a whole bunch of things that we wouldn't want to do on a computer that has exposure to the internet or is running an Intel CPU. So that is one of the really cool ways that I use Linux, and I am so thankful for those. Compartmentalization is so very important, and that is why I don't mind if I'm using a Mac. Another reason why I don't mind if I'm using a Mac is I actually use a YubiKey to store my 2FA tokens, or hashes I should have said, and when I generate them, I need to physically interact with this chip, and that is, cross-platform. It runs on Mac, it runs on whatever. Most of my security scheme in my mind is designed on top of compartmentalization. So I don't want to trust any specific piece of technology because they're all vulnerable to a whole bunch of different attacks. So maybe I've been talking a little bit much here, but put simply, I love macOS. I'm not sure I like what Apple is doing these days. I think Macs are becoming more and more like iPads. which is not my thing. I think that Catalina might be the last pure operating system that Mac has engineered. I think that I will be perhaps migrating to Linux one day, and I'm going to be bringing you guys along in this journey. But for the time being, I've tried switching my daily driver to Linux a few times. I did try Ubuntu among others, and I never felt the connection that I feel when I'm using macOS, And as I mentioned, I am using Tails and I am using, Raspbian or whatever. I am using other Linux distributions, and I am actually using a lot more Linux stuff in a headless way, so using command lines on servers and stuff. So yeah, hopefully this answers the question. If you have questions or comments, drop them in the comments and we can kind of like spawn a conversation around this. I know some people will hate me for everything I just said. That being said, that is totally fine. I'm looking forward to hearing you. And for those of you who are wondering if buying a Mac is still a good thing to do when you're privacy conscious, well, my answer to that is yes. I would highly recommend buying a secondhand 2015 computer. If you guys want me to create an episode on how to choose a computer, how to buy one secondhand, making sure that, you guys are not being screwed, I can, produce one of those for you guys. Yeah. Am I forgetting something here? Well, yeah, if you do have a 2015 computer, you'll be able to run Linux on it anyways, because driver support is super good, which is not the case for more recent Macs. Now, I am looking forward to seeing what Apple is going to come up with when they're going to be, using their own silicon, which essentially means they're licensing ARM stuff. I'm not sure what the word is. I'm not that knowledgeable about, hardware architecture stuff, but I am looking forward to this because an ARM chipset would be amazing. That being said, Apple has become more and more proprietary, less and less open to other operating systems. So I'm not sure this is going to be a good thing for us Linux users. Yeah, so hopefully this was helpful. I'll see you in the next episode. Bye.